There is very little in science that is more definitive than the success of vaccines at eliminating diseases that have killed hundreds of thousands a year, millions over their history. There is risk. Anytime you stick a needle inside your skin, you are risking infection. You are risking allergic reactions. They're just very small compared to the benefits.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Together, we can make a better future. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm reviewing the scientific evidence on the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines. I touched on this earlier during the pandemic, and I thought it was time to have a review to see where the science stands. This has been a contentious topic online and in social media discussions. There's been a flurry of misunderstandings and misinformation posted online, with the result of this all being a spreading vaccine hesitancy and a growing public health emergency. The World Health Organization highlighted vaccine hesitancy as one of the major global health risks that we're facing. Just this morning, in fact, I heard on the news announcements of measles outbreaks. Vaccines work. They've saved millions of lives. There is very little in science that is more definitive than the success of vaccines at eliminating diseases that have killed hundreds of thousands a year, millions over their history. Vaccines have eliminated smallpox and virtually eliminated polio, measles. No one needs to be hospitalized for measles if we keep our herd immunity up and keep vaccinating against it. The measles vaccine is not 100% effective. It's about 80% effective, if I recall off the top. And if we have people that don't vaccinate, a significant fraction, then infections are going to leak in and infect people that have done everything they can to prevent it. And this means that thousands of children will be hospitalized. Measles is highly contagious, one of the most contagious diseases around. That being said, there is risk associated with vaccines. Anytime you stick a needle inside your skin, you are risking infection. You are risking allergic reactions. Can we have a frank talk about the actual risks? We're not getting it on social media. Anyone who wants to go find the results, everyone is afraid to talk about the actual scientific data and give people numbers because experts think that it's going to make people confused. It's going to be too difficult to follow. It's going to make people upset if you actually admit there's risks. So there are risks. They're just very small compared to the benefits. And I'd like to try to give you an understanding of what the science says. Now, I'm not an expert in medical fields. I'm a physicist, but I'm able to read the papers and understand the math that's being presented and the statistics, and I'm going to try to present as much as I can what the science is actually telling us. If you do enjoy this, I would like you to press like on your podcast app. Feel free to come follow me on Podbean. Look me up on my Facebook group, The Rational View, and have your say. Give me your inputs. Tell me what you think. So, what do we know? Overall, looking at recent polling results, a majority of Americans believe the benefits of the coronavirus vaccines outweigh the risks. So this is good. They tend to align with the idea that COVID-19 vaccines have saved millions of lives. Even Donald Trump brags about his Operation Warp Speed vaccines doing great things. At the same time, fewer than half consider the preventative health benefits of the vaccines to be high, and more describe the risk of side effects as medium or high than view them as low. Now, this is a misconception. And why do these people have this misconception? Obviously, there's people like Kennedy out there spreading misinformation. There is data out there that is scary. The public U.S. Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, may bear some responsibility for stoking vaccine-related fears. This is a database available for the public where you can go and report any vaccine-related side effects, and it's kind of used by the medical community to flag problems if things come up again and again. But the data is available for the public to look, and it's not screened for reliability. So if you believe the vaccine caused aliens to probe you, it's going to be listed on this website as a potential side effect. And so people can go on this and look at these things and say, oh my God, the aliens are probing people with vaccines. Well, it's not verified. You need to vet this just a little bit. In the instance, for example, where the majority of the population, 80+% of people get vaccinated for COVID, there's going to be several coincidental diagnoses of serious disease that seem to randomly align with vaccination dates, because people are getting diseases and getting diagnosed in the background at a particular rate. And if they're all being vaccinated, then some people's diagnoses are going to line up with the vaccination just by chance. This is obvious, but a lot of people don't think about this. You need to have a comparison of the background rate of disease with the rate of disease with vaccination to start attributing these things to the vaccination. If the rate of disease is a fixed number and the vaccines don't increase that number, then they aren't actually causing anything. In the mind of these unlucky individuals, however, the vaccine is going to be to blame. And these are the people that are going to go post online and say, I got such and such disease because of the vaccine. I mean, it's very similar to anything. If you're like, in nuclear reactor explosions at Fukushima, one person got lung cancer and he got compensated from the government for radiation related sickness. But, he was also a pack-a-day smoker, and nobody thought that, maybe this isn't really radiation. So how can one who is not doesn't have time to read the scientific papers, wouldn't understand how to do this, how can any one person disentangle random coincidence with actual causality? The way you do this in science is we have large controlled studies that compare the rates of disease in vaccinated folks to unvaccinated population. We also need to separate the impacts of COVID-caused secondary diseases from vaccine-caused effects. A lot of people, are getting effects from COVID rather than from the vaccine. And how can you disentangle these things? You need to look at statistics. Statistics is the tool that you can use that can disentangle these things. My summary, a TLDR, for this podcast is, in general, the virus is much worse than the vaccine in causing all of these secondary effects. But the vaccine does cause problems in certain small proportions of individuals. So I want to give a little bit of background on the COVID vaccines that you may have heard of, the mRNA vaccines. And these are the special vaccines that were pushed through so quickly in Operation Warp Speed. COVID vaccines available are mRNA based. So what is mRNA? This is messenger RNA. Well, let me give you the introductory genetics version of this, because I did take an introductory genetics course in university, because it's really interesting stuff, and I wanted to understand this stuff because it's at the basis of all of modern biology. So I apologize in advance for any outsider mistakes. But here's the kind of the 3,000-foot version. Messenger RNA is a molecule. It's what our cells use as an assembly drawing to build proteins. And proteins are what your whole body is made of. What everything that does things in your body is made of, these proteins that are coded in our DNA. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is the stable master blueprint that is kept in a little vault in all of our cells. It's called the nucleolus. It's a tiny little vault that bops around in the nucleus of our cells. And there's an enzyme in each cell called RNA polymerase that that searches through this DNA library and reads sections of these blueprints. It kind of transcribes DNA blueprints into RNA, which is ribonucleic acid. And RNA is kind of like a mirror image of the DNA code. So DNA has these base pairs which our body can translate into proteins. And RNA is just a mirror image replica of these blueprints. So these blueprints sit in here and are supposed to be unchanged, quote unquote, supposed to be. I'm adding personification, or I forget the right word, but when things are operating as we believe they're best, RNA polymerase creates RNA based on the DNA templates in this little nucleolus. And these strings of RNA molecules, which are not the full length of the DNA, they're kind of limited by different sections of DNA. They're sent out into the nucleus of the cell through specialized pores in the nucleolus membrane. So now we have these RNA molecules that are in transcriptions of our DNA that float into the nucleus. And these strings are called precursor messenger RNA. They're not actually yet ready to make proteins because they have these sections in them that actually aren't supposed to be part of the code. They're called introns, and they're called non-coding DNA, and they're separated by certain little strings of repeating base pairs. And there's an enzyme, an organelle called a spliceosome that is responsible for removing these non-coding sections of the recipe. This is kind of like when you go online to search for a recipe and you have to skip over all the filler and the life story of the person who invented it to find the actual recipe ingredients and the cooking instructions. And the spliceosome is the thing that cuts out all that crap and gets you to the recipe. So here we got the DNA, the polymerase creates the precursor messenger RNA, pops it out into the nucleus. In the nucleus, the spliceosome cuts out the boring parts, leaving the useful parts, and then it goes out through another membrane in the nucleus into the rest of the cell, or the cytoplasm as it's called. So when the messenger RNA is now released into the cell cytoplasm, which is kind of the fluid in the rest of the cell, outside of the headquarters in the nucleus, there are little molecular machines called ribosomes in our cells. And these things bind to messenger RNAs and translate the drawing into proteins. They're basically the chef, and they're going through the steps in the messenger RNA. You got kind of this construction drawing, and it's transferring it into an actual working protein. It's an amazing system. And the messenger RNA is fragile. It breaks down in the cell after about 10 hours. So it's out there. They're making several copies of proteins for each one as the ribosomes translate through them. They read it, they build. Eventually, the messenger RNA breaks down. It doesn't last. The thing that lasts is the DNA, which is in that special vault of the cell. It's protected. So what's this got to do with vaccines? Well, scientists came up with a great idea to use the cellular machinery in our cells to create proteins that would stimulate our immune system and protect us against the COVID-19 viruses. So how does that work? So COVID-19 viruses are little tiny particles which are made of proteins, just like the proteins that our cells can manufacture. In fact, people's cells manufacture COVID-19 viruses when they're infected. The virus of COVID-19 works very similarly to the vaccine in that it co-opts the cellular machinery to make copies of itself. So when you're infected with COVID-19, the virus injects its messenger RNA into your cell, and the ribosomes in your cell make little COVID-19 viruses, and then they all explode outward and infect more cells. And that's the generic version of how viruses infect us. They co-opt the machinery of the cell to create copies of themselves. Well, how does the immune system protect you from these viruses? Well, the immune system is able to recognize proteins on the surface of the virus, and the defensive parts of our immune system go and bind up these viruses and take them away to be destroyed before they can infect anything. So if you have enough antibodies in your cell, or in your bloodstream, in your body. These antiviruses bind up the COVID-19 viruses and get them destroyed before they can infect anything. So how do we prime our immune system to recognize these COVID-19 viruses? If you've never been infected, your immune system doesn't recognize them, and you can often be subject to an infection. But if your immune system recognizes the proteins on the cell and is primed to make antibodies in high speeds, then you're good. And this is the science of vaccination takes advantage of this. It primes the immune system by showing it proteins that it's going to see on the virus and getting your body to make antibodies to these proteins and protect you. Now, the problem is that you basically, how do you do this? How are we going to get COVID-19 proteins into your body so that your immune system can recognize it without actually infecting you with COVID-19? So scientists, what they did was they extracted RNA code from the virus's genome, and they took the code that builds the proteins, they called spike proteins, that are on the outside of the COVID virus. So the scientists took the RNA from the virus genome that makes these spike proteins when the virus infects you. They coat the fragile RNA. Scientists coated the fragile RNA with lipid membranes, so like like a grease or a fat, to protect it from breaking down. And then this is what's injected into your body. And in your body, these lipid vesicles can fuse with your cells and release the messenger RNA into the cytoplasm, where your cells' ribosomes will bind to them and create these spike proteins that will then leak out of the cell. And these spike proteins can be recognized by our immune system and build up an immune response, or prime the immune system to respond when you are actually infected with virus. So in this way, because we're just putting snippets of the RNA in, there's no viruses, there's no viral effect. The proteins are just just something that bonds to cells. So far, the evidence suggests that these vaccines are effective over about a period of 4 to 6 months. Now, yay, but hey, why is this period so short? And that's something I just learned researching this. It's really cool. So some some vaccines and infections are much more long lasting. You can have lifelong immunity to certain things. So researchers have found that COVID-19 vaccines fail to generate mature and durable antibody-producing cells in the bone marrow. So what happens typically when you get an infection is that the body responds, it makes lots of antibodies, and then it builds these antibody-producing cells that stay in your bone marrow. And these things can live for a long time. If they mature, they'll be there for years potentially. And if you're ever impacted by a similar protein, these things will pump out antibodies really fast and protect you from them. So it's really kind of cool. But it turns out some of these antibodies, some of the proteins that are being expressed by viruses resemble proteins that your body makes naturally. And if you have a reaction to things in your body that are part of your body, then you get autoimmune diseases. So a lot of viruses can fool your immune system by having proteins that are similar to your body's own proteins. And your body has a defense mechanism for autoimmune diseases. In general, these antibody-producing bone marrow cells, they only mature if they aren't binding to the body's own proteins. So this is how the body prevents autoimmune diseases. So it turns out that cells that provide antibodies to COVID-19 spike proteins don't mature in the bone marrow. And so they only last for about 4 to 6 months before they die off, and you need another infection or vaccine to boost up your immunity. So it turns out that the spike protein antigens are similar enough to something in the body, or fool the body's immune system into not producing stable antibody producing cells. And this also, I think, could probably account for the smattering of autoimmune disease activations reported for both COVID and the vaccine. So very interesting, I think. I've learned a lot about how the immune system actually works and how the body protects itself against autoimmune responses, or how it does when things are working well, the way we like it. So I want to now go into a little bit about adverse vaccine reactions and autoimmune responses and things that actually have happened, to give you a feel for what the scientific papers say. So one of the most well-known reactions or adverse reactions to the vaccine was myocarditis in young men. Myocarditis is a swelling of the heart muscle or the surroundings of the heart. And as a result, certain vaccines were kind of blacklisted for adolescent males. And this is, a very rare thing. There was a study in England where they tracked 43 million people and their reactions to vaccines at the height of the pandemic. And in the results, for men under 40, there were up to 14 extra cases of myocarditis associated with a first vaccine. This is extra, above the normal background rate you'd expect in such a large population. And there were something like 97 extra cases of myocarditis per million people associated with a second dose of the Moderna vaccine back early on in the pandemic. So this is effectively one chance in 10,000 of getting myocarditis due to the vaccine. And this is a concern. This is why scientists were concerned, and they suggested that, maybe young men shouldn't be getting this vaccine. So it was recommended against once it became known. But we should also look at, the cost-benefit analysis here. So COVID itself, if you become infected by COVID, it also can cause myocarditis. And COVID caused something like 16 extra cases of myocarditis per million infections in the same age group for unvaccinated men. And this risk was cut in half for people who contracted the disease after having at least one vaccine dose. So it turns out for this particular ailment, 2 doses of the vaccine was worse than the disease for this age group and sex. For women 40 and older, vaccines caused less than 3 extra cases of myocarditis per million people, whereas COVID caused 51 cases per million. This is what you would call significantly protective. So although there is like a 3 in a million chance of getting myocarditis from the vaccine, you're protected against a 51 in a million chance of getting it from COVID. Also, we should consider, what other protections are we getting from the vaccine? Well, the COVID death rate for men under 40 was 0.2% as of February 2020. So for a man under 40 taking 2 doses of Moderna, which is the worst situation at all for this myocarditis, it came with a 1 in 10,000 risk of getting myocarditis as a side effect. And because it wasn't perfectly protective, there was still roughly a 2 in 10,000 chance of dying from a COVID infection anyway. But if you didn't get infected or didn't get the vaccine, you were facing a 2 in 1,000 chance of death from infection. So that's, or 20 in 10,000. So it's, if you're going to get the disease, it's much better to get the vaccine if you're going to be exposed to COVID. But this isn't the only story. Myocarditis is certainly a potentially serious disease. All of the people that got it in this study recovered without expectation of side effects in the majority of cases. I'm sure in some of the cases there's probably longer lasting side effects. But again, Similarly, in COVID, there's long COVID, if you've heard of that. In a 2023 study, they looked at how vaccination impacted the chance of getting long COVID. And the results of that study showed that 2-dose vaccination reduced the incidence of long COVID by 64%. And long COVID is characterized mainly by persistent fatigue and potentially some other pulmonary disorders or rheumatoid arthritis, things like that. And incidence levels of long COVID could be as high as 10% of people with symptoms, extending beyond 1 year after infection. So getting the vaccine halves your chance down to, something like 4% chance of getting these long COVIDs. So I want to go into other studies that I've found. There are cases of rare autoimmune disorders showing up as a result of the vaccine and also as a result of the virus. One is called the Guillain-Barré syndrome. And for this one, the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine was found to increase the incidence of Guillain-Barré syndrome, again, some sort of an autoimmune disease. It was found to increase the incidence by a factor of 21 times higher than after receiving any of the other vaccines. The baseline rate of Guillain-Barré syndrome in the population in general is on the order of 1 chance in 2 million per month. So it becomes about 1 in 100,000 for the month after receiving a Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine. So again, we're talking very small numbers, but also, relatively serious diseases. There's also, of course, the chance of getting anaphylactic shock, and that occurs in about 5 out of every million doses, and typically their medical experts are available to treat that on site and are prepared for that, and they screen you for that. So, not typically a lethal impact and something that goes away. I also want to talk about something called multisystem inflammatory syndrome in unvaccinated children and vaccinated children. This is a very serious disease, which is a result of young children getting COVID. And it's got like a 1 to 2% mortality rate. In other words, 1 to 2% of kids that have MIS die. So it's very serious. And, a lot of people are concerned about whether I should give COVID to my children. What are the risks and what are the benefits? Because COVID really didn't have a big impact in terms of hospitalizing or killing children. COVID itself, the disease, very few kids were killed directly by the primary COVID infection. So there was a new study in 2025, so very recently, of children in California that shows that unvaccinated children are at a much higher risk of developing severe multisystem inflammatory syndrome if they're unvaccinated. So for the data are as follows. For 12 to 17-year-olds, the incidence of MIS was about 1 in 300,000 for vaccinated children versus 1 in 13,000 for unvaccinated children. So that's a factor of about 28 between vaccination and unvaccination. It's still, a relatively low number, but the vaccine is, although it doesn't prevent it entirely, significantly reduces it. And for children aged 5 to 11, younger children, about 1 in 40,000 unvaccinated kids came down with this syndrome, whereas it was 1 in 140,000 for vaccinated children. So a factor of 3 decrease in the risk after vaccination. So this means that, vaccination reduces chances of getting this very severe autoimmune disease by a factor of 20 in 12 to 17-year-olds and a factor of more than 3 in 5 to 11-year-olds. There was also a study of over 5 million children vaccinated in the UK, and they verified the risks of myocarditis that I've mentioned before. In 12 to 17-year-olds, there's a risk of 1 in 125,000 of the modern vaccine of getting myocarditis from the vaccine, from 2 doses of the vaccine. So 1 in 125,000 is the chance of having this myocarditis. And I just want to quote from the study. So we found no strong evidence for increased risks of 12 pre-specified vaccine safety outcomes following COVID-19 vaccination in children aged 5 to 11 years, and no new significant safety concerns in 12 to 17-year-olds following vaccination with mRNA vaccines recommended for use in these age groups in the UK. Additionally, in unvaccinated children, we found increased risks of hospitalization from 7 adverse outcomes, including MIS-C and myocarditis, following SARS-CoV-2 infection that were either not observed or were reduced following vaccination. Overall, our findings support a favorable safety profile of COVID-19 vaccination using mRNA vaccines in children and young people aged 5 to 17 years. So I wanted to present this data to you so that you understand the kind of numbers that are involved in the risks. And so that's not just scare memes on the internet. You know, we're talking numbers of typically less than 1 in 10,000, probably on the order of 1 in 100,000 having some adverse health effect from the vaccine, and being protective significantly of similar health effects coming from the COVID virus itself. So you have the data. You don't need to be that afraid. I think in general, vaccination is helpful. And what this analysis of, single person effects doesn't take into account is the herd immunity protection effect, the possibility of protecting your elderly relatives from transmission of the disease. Because once you've been vaccinated, the viral load that you give off if you are infected is much less than the viral load you give off if you're unvaccinated. So you are less contagious if you've been vaccinated. You're less likely to spread the disease. You're less likely to have significant side effects if you get the disease. So I hope you've learned something from this discussion. I know I did learn something from investigating it, and I'd be happy to chat more about this on my Facebook group. Thank you for listening to The Rational View.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patron page at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Thanks for listening.